until recently, this would have been a very uncommon sight. Deserted streets, trains that are nearly empty, and normally you'd see people rushing to work at this hour of the morning. You know, this mask, in many ways, is a symbol of a theme that we study in history: change and continuity. Now, we're going through a great period of change in Australia and around the world. We're facing a pandemic. But you know, that's not the first pandemic we've ever had in history. And you study disease and pandemics as part of your course. Now, we can probably learn a lot about how people reacted to them and how they were impacted by these pandemics. So the key question for this Australian History Mystery is, what were the pandemics of the past and what can we learn from plagues in history? I said that the sight of this mask would have been unusual until recently. But that's not true for kids your age living in Australia 100 years ago. In 1918, an influenza pandemic devastated the world, and it was brought into Australia in 1919 by returning soldiers who had contracted it in Europe at the end of World War I. In fact, this pandemic killed more people worldwide than lives lost during the war. Australian authorities knew it was coming and were able to test for it and quarantine people, so it did less damage in here than in many countries, but it was still deadly and tragic. This is the Brighton Cemetery in Melbourne, and here is the grave of Flight Sergeant Frederick P. Moore, a member of the No. 1 Squadron of the Australian Flying Corps. Now, Frederick was a mechanic, and his job was to keep the planes flying. So it was not a dangerous task, but he would have witnessed firsthand some of the horrors of the war, welcoming home wounded pilots from a mission, or indeed waiting for planes to return that in fact never did return. Frederick survived the war, and after 4 years he returned home to the loving arms of his wife Lillian and daughter Agnes, looking forward to a peaceful future. Sadly, that was not to occur, because only 1 week later he died of influenza at the tender age of 28, leaving behind him a sorrowful widow and a young girl fatherless. This grave is in the Footscray Cemetery, and it's the grave of William Glenn and his wife Stella, both of whom died of influenza. William on the 3rd of May 1919, and his wife Stella 5 days before that, on the 29th of April. What's really sad about this gravestone is that they left behind 2 daughters, aged 1 and 2. No one knows what happened to those girls, but we can only hope that William and Stella's family took them in and looked after them. So these gravestones help us to understand that when we study a disease in the past, we're looking at tragedies that affect not only individuals, but whole communities. And here's yet another grave, this time the grave of a nursing sister. And it brings home another aspect of the tragedy of influenza, in that people who were caring for others often caught the disease themselves. Sister Alice McGuinness bravely gave her life nursing influenza patients, and she died on the 10th of February 1919. Probably the worst example of disease is the Black Death. It spread through Asia, Europe and the Middle East in the 1300s. It possibly killed up to half the population of places it affected at the time. But of course, we don't really know how many. But just imagine what half the population is. What if half your class suddenly was not at school? It was a terrible death, as described by one Italian writer. In men and women alike at the beginning of this malady, certain swellings, either on the groin or under the armpits, waxed to the bigness of a common apple, others to the size of an egg. Blood and pus seeped out of these strange swellings, which were followed by a host of other unpleasant symptoms. fever, chills, vomiting, diarrhoea, terrible aches and pains, and then, in short order, death. And then the impact on society. All the citizens did little else except to carry dead bodies to be buried. At every church they dug deep pits down to the water table. Those who were poor, who died during the night, were bundled up quickly and thrown into the pit. The plague eased, but never fully went away. It came back to England in the 1600s, killing almost a quarter of London's population and spreading into the countryside. 30 years ago, I visited Eyam, a little town in Derbyshire, to find out why it was known as the Plague Village. Little did I know then how significant that visit would become.
Cast your mind back some 300 years and try to imagine a horse and cart rattling along this narrow street, delivering goods that have come all the way from London. It stops outside this little cottage. It has a delivery of cloth for the local tailor, a man called George Vickers. George comes to the door. He's very pleased to receive his package at long last. George opens his parcel and finds that the cloth is damp. He hangs it in front of the fire to dry, and a few days later, he dies. Within 2 weeks, 2 other people who lived in this house had also died. The plague had come to Eyam. This is a particularly sad cottage because the Siddle family lived here during the plague. Elizabeth, the mother, buried her husband and 5 children in 1665. The following year, her daughter Emmet was also taken by the plague, only weeks before she was about to be married. Elizabeth herself died soon after, and her only surviving child was adopted by a man who had lost 7 of his own children during that time. When you consider that 270 people died here during the plague, why have I only been able to find the headstone of one of these people? And that belongs to Mrs. Catherine Mompesson, the wife of the rector who preached here. Where were all of the other plague victims buried?
What did the people of the village do to keep the plague from spreading? There are many lessons that we can learn from the brave people of Eyam. When the plague arrived in September 1665, rather than flee and risk spreading the infection, villagers locked themselves away to suffer in isolation. The graveyard was shut and bodies were dragged into the fields for burial. Money was left at the town boundary to pay for food and goods brought in by neighbouring villages. There is so much that history can teach us, and I'm going to surprise you now. When you think of the Black Death, I'm sure you think of medieval times, England, Italy, strange ideas about causes, and little knowledge of how to treat it. But it also occurred in Australia, and only a bit over 100 years ago. Look at these photographs. They show typical living conditions for a lot of poor people, poor working class people in Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane in 1900. And now look at this map. It shows where the plague hit in 1900, in Sydney, near the docks where ships from overseas docked, and in the poorest and oldest parts of the city. And here's the cause: bites from fleas carried by the rats. As well as influenza and the plague, there has been another devastating disease in Australia, and it dates right back to the start of the European colonisation. It is smallpox. When the first fleet people came ashore in Sydney on the 26th of January 1788, they brought with them a whole swag of things that were new to Australia. New animals, crops and foods, new weapons and tools, new laws, new language, new beliefs and attitudes and experiences and culture, and new germs. One of those was smallpox, a disease that appeared in spots, and if the person survived, they were marked with small pits in their skin. It was a deadly disease, but most of the First Fleet people had had the disease before and had developed immunity to it. The doctors had brought some of the disease with them in little glass bottles, so that if they needed to, they could vaccinate people to protect them from it. Somehow, and we do not know how, it seems that the smallpox was released, devastating the local Aboriginal people who had no immunity to it. More than half the local people, men and women, old ones and children, were killed. This meant the total disruption of their society, beliefs, customs and laws. Sadly, the disease continued to spread, probably carried by people moving along waterways, even as far as Aboriginal people who had never seen a white person and would not for decades. This catastrophic event did not only happen in Australia. It had also happened centuries before in Central and Southern America to the Aztec and the Inca people. In those places, small bands of Spanish soldiers, conquistadors or conquerors, had invaded these empires, seeking gold and souls. They were tough men, mercenaries for the most part, ready to do anything to make a fortune. They faced huge numbers of fighters, brave men from a different civilization who would fight for their own lives, families and homes. The conquistadors had superior weapons and horses, but there were very few of them. They should have been destroyed, but they won. Why? Part of the reason is that they had a secret weapon, their germs. As with Aboriginal people, the native people of the Inca and Aztec empires did not have immunity to these new germs, and they were cut down in their millions by deadly diseases. Germs had become a weapon of war. The Aztec and Inca warriors were destroyed before they could really put up a good fight. The conquistadors stripped the land of its gold and silver, and you can see much of it now in the magnificent churches of Spain. So pandemics, diseases and plagues have been a very important part of world history, Australian history, community history and family history. And this place is a stark reminder of that. It's the quarantine station here at Point Nepean. That's the entrance to Port Phillip Bay. And in the 19th century, all of the ships coming from Europe would have to stop here, people would come ashore and they would be quarantined for a number of weeks to make sure that they were free of disease. This is a very special monument. It actually marks the spot of the first cemetery here at the quarantine station. But due to sea erosion, lots of those graves were washed away. So this stone is a reminder of that. But I'm more interested in the story of the Ticonderoga, known as the Fever Ship. Now that was a ship that came out from Liverpool in 1852. It left in August and arrived in November. It had 800 people on board. 100 died en route of diseases like typhus and the measles. Upon arrival, everyone was quarantined for 7 weeks. 400 people were seriously ill and another 70 people died and were buried on this very spot. This is another gravestone, and it's also about the tragedy of the fever ship Ticonderoga. This one is a family gravestone. The McRaes came out here in 1852, and within 2 months of arriving at the quarantine station, mother and 4 children had perished. So when you study history, expect to be sad. That's okay. But I also hope that you'll be uplifted, because there have been so many marvellous medical discoveries over the years that have helped to save the lives of millions of people. Who knows? There could be another medical discovery on the way now, and then you and I and everybody else around the world can hopefully throw these masks away.